All right, let's continue. And let's learn how we can use this template that we've come up with here for where the notes are to start actually making some music with it. And the first thing we want to do is figure out which notes we might want to use in a particular song. And to do that, we want to make it simpler again. This is still too many notes. We've got 100, which is great, but if we want to play a particular song, we got to choose a smaller amount of this 100 and say, these are the ones that we're going to use for this song. We don't need the full palette. And we're going to do that again in a sort of logical way. We're not just going to pick them at random. And that brings us to another just hugely important concept. And really the whole point of this video is that all of music, basically, and I know this is going to sound ridiculous, almost all of music comes down to one simple pattern that takes advantage of why we divided these octaves into 12. And that pattern is essentially just picking a starting point. Let's make it easy and choose the first note of our octave here. And going 2 over from that, 2 over from that, 1 over this time, 2 over, 2 over, and 2 over from that, and then stopping. Now, you'll notice that we had that weird moment where we went 1 over, and that might seem odd. Why not just space them all evenly? And the answer, of course, is that this will have an advantage that will become more clear in a second, but just bear with me because I know the pattern is a little arbitrary seeming. And it is a pattern, so if we want to repeat the pattern, you'll notice that we just have to go over one note from where we started. And that will give us the first note that corresponds to the one we started on in the original octave. Now, let's number all of these notes so that we can sort of keep track of them. The 1 will be where we start, all the way up through 7. And then when the pattern restarts in a new octave, we'll just start back at 1. And let's hear how these sound in order. Great. You'll probably recognize that, or you might recognize it, even if you don't know the name. And that basically is what we call the major scale. In fact, you probably expected to hear one more note, and that's just the first note again in the higher octave. That makes it feel slightly more complete, right? I mean, you hear that. It feels like it starts in one place and it ends in the correct place, which is 1 octave higher. That seems to make a complete scale. A scale is just playing any of these notes that we've selected here in order and ending at the same note that we started on 1 octave higher. And if we applied that same pattern to all of the octaves, not just this 1 octave, and we took the notes that basically correspond to these notes in every octave, and we looked at all of those together, that would be what we call a key. It's all of the notes generated by this simple pattern in every octave. And you've probably heard this concept before. When people say things like, that song's in the key of C major, or G major, or E minor, or whatever, they're essentially telling you, and more specifically other musicians, which notes the song is going to primarily use. You might use some of these other notes that are not necessarily in the key, but they're very much the exception. They're there to add like color and kind of surprise or jolt the listener a little. The majority of the notes for any particular song will come from a particular key. And we can move the starting point Originally, we started here on this note, but what if we moved it over one and started on this note and just applied the exact same pattern? Well, of course, we just have a new key, a slightly different key that you'll hear sounds kind of similar if we play a scale. That still sounds like a major pattern. It's just the whole thing has been shifted up a little, up one note. And we can do that for any of the 12 notes in our octave. We can do it for any note, really. But once we go past an octave and we choose the starting point that's the same position as the earlier note, you can see we're applying a pattern, so it's just going to generate the same notes. So there's really only 12 different keys that we can have here. But if you're that early human aspiring musician, you might start to play around with these major scales and impress everyone by making something that sounds kind of cool, but you're going to get bored of that a little quickly. So you start to play around and you think, what if instead of starting on starting on the first note of this reduced set, this key, what if instead we start on, say, the 6 and we go from 6 to 6? What does that sound like? That's pretty cool too. And you notice it has a little different character than the first one, right? Let's hear 1 to 1 again. And we can start at any point in the key. It doesn't really matter. We don't have to start on the 1 and go to the 1, obviously, or start on the 6 and go to the 6. We can start on the 2 and go to the 2, and that has a slightly different quality. I know I'm throwing a lot of terminology at you here really quickly, but these are essentially just called modes. We've got the major mode, the Dorian mode, the minor mode, the Mixolydian mode, all these 7 different modes. And this is a concept that actually, for some reason, in traditional musical education, takes people years to get to because it's explained very badly. We've just covered it pretty quickly here on the first day, so we're doing pretty good. But now, unfortunately, we have to talk about something that is overwhelmingly, almost ludicrously stupid. And that is the note names. You might remember that I said that some people might say something like a song is in the key of C major, D major, E minor, or something like that. And now we kind of know what the major and the minor mean. But there's still that first letter. It's that note. It might be C or D or E or D sharp or something like that. And unfortunately, we're stuck with this really dumb system of labeling the notes that is really just a consequence of very poor planning and musicians throughout history, their inability to go back and adjust their way of doing things. So these notes here, not the numbers, which is a logical system that makes sense, but the actual notes on the spectrum and their pitch all have actual names that never change. The note never moves. There's no keys or anything like that. It's just the note corresponds to a specific pitch. And it turns out that the reason I was picking 32 for where we'd start a lot of these things is because that note is called C. And all of the notes an octave away, in this case the big gray lines, are also called C, which actually makes sense. And all the notes in between the C's have their own name. But the way that they're labeled is really counterintuitive. It goes C, C sharp, D, D sharp, E, and then for some reason F, and then F sharp, G, G sharp, A sharp, B, and then there's no B sharp again, and it just goes back to C, which is really dumb again, and I don't want you to get super bogged down on this. It's just going to be useful for figuring out a reference for where you're going to start the pattern. Oh, and it's even dumber than that, actually, because all of these notes that have a sharp in it can also be called by the higher note flat. So something like A sharp can also be called B flat. It's the exact same note, it just has two different names because sharp means a little bit to the right or a little bit higher, and flat means a little bit to the left or a little bit lower. So some of these notes have two names that people use completely interchangeably. There's no notes between B and C or E and F, or there's no sharps or flats, I should say. And the whole system is, of course, ridiculous. But we're stuck with it. So we're going to just know this information and not worry about it too much. And we're going to move on to a system that is a lot more sensible, because now that we know where certain notes are on our hearing range, and we know how to select certain notes by using this one pattern to generate a key, which will give us the notes that a song could use, or probably will use the majority of, we're going to start to answer the question, the much more interesting question, of how do you use these notes to actually make a song? How do songwriters do it? How do they use the notes and combine them to actually make music? And for that, we're going to move to a different way of visualizing this, because this spectrum is great for understanding where the notes are and explaining keys and all that. But it's not, you can see it's not going to be very great if we start to look at songs this way, because we can barely even see some of these octaves over here on the left. And the right's taking up, half the screen. So we're going to move to a system that visualizes the notes a little differently and hopefully is a little more fun to look at.